close this out. Wish me luck on this book and in pronunciation. I do not how to put Tau. Is it Toussaint? Toussaint? Toussaint Louverture?
Louverture, yeah.
Louverture. All right, I'll try. All right, the Black Jacobin. We're going to go with this first paragraph. I'm going to reread it anyways. C.L.R. James, 1901 to 1989, was a Trinidadian-born historian, literary critic, and philosopher, and the leader of a Pan-African movement. A prodigious and electric intellectual, he debated Marcus Garvey in England, confronted Trotsky in Mexico, and influenced leaders of African revolutions, including Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. He is perhaps best remembered for his 1938 masterwork, The Black Jacobins, the first major analysis of the Haitian Revolution in the context of the French Revolution. In addition to his many works of history and his political activism, he was known as well for occasional playwriting and fiction. His novels, Miti Ali, written in 1927, was the first by a Black West Indian to be published in Britain. James was also known as a vivid sportsman. He was a cricket writer and for the Manchester Guardian, beginning in the 1930s, and his 1963 book, Beyond the Boundary, which he describes as neither cricket, reminiscence, or autobiography, has been hailed as the best single book on cricket ever written. All right, everybody. It's a little bit of that. We'll go down to, I don't know, should we read the prefaces or nah? I don't know. Let's find out. What's the first preface? Let's see here. How many prefaces are there? Not too many. Might explain some things, though. Let's find out. Preface to the first edition, 1938. In 1789, the French West Indian colony of San Domingo supplied 2/3 of the overseas trade to France. It was the greatest individual market for the European slave trade. It was an integral part of the economic life of the age. The greatest colony in the world, the pride of France, and the envy of every other imperialist nation, the whole structure rested on the labor of 500,000 slaves. In August 1791, after 2 years of the French Revolution and its repercussions in San Domingo, the slaves revolted. The struggle lasted for 12 years. The slaves defeated in turn the local whites and the soldiers of the French monarchy, a Spanish invasion, a British expedition, and some 60,000 men, and a French expedition of similar size under Bonaparte's brother-in-law. The defeat of Bonaparte's expedition in 1803 resulted in the establishment of the Black State, they use the N-word, of Haiti, which has lasted to this day. The revolt is the only successful slave revolt in history, and the odds it had to overcome is evident of the magnitude of the interests that were involved. The transformation of slaves trembling in hundreds before a single white man into a people able to organize themselves and to defeat the most powerful European nation of their day is one of the greatest epics of revolutionary struggles and achievement. Why and how this happened is the theme of this book. By a phenomenon often observed, the individual leadership responsible for this unique achievement was almost entirely the work of a single man. Toussaint Louverture.
Toussaint
Louverture. Boot camp in the biography Universelle calls Toussaint Louverture one of the most remarkable men of a period rich in remarkable men. He dominated from his entire entry until circumstances removed him from the scene. The history of San Domingo Revolution will therefore largely be a record of his achievements and his political personality. The writers believe that and is confident the narrative will prove that between 1789 and 1815, with a single exception of Bonaparte himself, one single figure appeared on the historical stage more greatly gifted than this black person. They used the N-word, a slave till he was 45. Yet Toussaint, I'm gonna have to try that. What is it again? Toussaint did not make the revolution. It was the revolution that made Toussaint. And even that is not the whole truth. The writing of history becomes even more difficult. The power of God or the weakness of man, Christianity or the divine right of kings to govern wrong can easily be made responsible for the downfall of states and the birth of a new society. Each elementary conception lend themselves willingly to the narrative treatment of and from Tacitus to the melancholy, right? Macaulay. From, oh my gosh, this is hard. The Thucydides to Green. The traditional famous historians have been more artists than scientists. They wrote so well because they saw so little. Today, by a natural reaction, we tend to personification of the social forces, great men being merely and nearly instruments in the hands of economic destiny. As so often, the truth does not lie in between. Great men make history, but only such history as it is possible for them to make. Their freedom of achievement is limited by the necessity of their environment. To portray the limits of those necessities and the realization, complete or partial, of all possibilities, that is the true business of the historian. In revolution, when the ceaselessly slow accumulation of centuries bursts into a volcanic eruption, the meteoric flares and flights above are a meaningless chaos and lend themselves to infinite caprice and romanticism, unless the observer sees them always as projections of the subsoil from which they came. The writer has sought not only to analyze but to demonstrate in their movements the economic force of the age, their molding of society and politics, of men in the mass and individual men. The powerful reaction of these on their environment at one of those rare moments when society is at boiling point, therefore fluid. The analysis is the science of the demonstration, the art which is history. The violent conflict of our age enable our practice. Practiced, right?
No, practiced. You have it. It's practiced.
I don't know why it's a vision of seeing into the very bones in previous revolutions more easily than theretofore. Yet, for that very reason, it is impossible to recollect historical emotions in that tranquility which a great English writer, too narrowly associated with poetry alone. Tranquility today is either innate or to be acquired only by a deliberate doping of the personality. It was in the stillness of a seaside suburb that could be heard most clearly and intensely the boom of Franco's heavy artillery and the rattle of Stalin's firing squad and the fierce, shrill turmoil of the revolutionary movement striving for clarity and influence. Such is our age, and this book is of it, with something of the fever and the fret nor does the writer regret it. The book is the history of a revolution and writing under different circumstances. It would have been a different, but not necessarily a better book. C.L.R. James. And the next one, Preface, in 1962, Preface of the Vintage Edition. This book was written in 1938. Today, I have little to add or to subtract from the fundamental ideas which govern this conception. They are far more common properties now than they were 25 years ago, where they fly in the face of historical events. I have omitted or altered them never more than to the extent of a few lines. I have retained a concluding page, which envisage of and were intended to simulate the coming emancipation of Africa. They are a part of the history of our time. In 1938, only the writer and a handful of close associates thought, wrote, and spoke as if the African events of the last quarter of the century were imminent. The appendix from Toussaint Louverture to Fidel Castro, attempts for the future of the West Indies, all of them, what has done for Africa in 1938. Writers on the West Indies always relate them to their proximation to Britain, France, Spain, and America. That is to say, to Western civilization, never in relations to their own history. This is their attempt for the first time. C.L.R. James, January 4th, 1962. Introduction. The radical novelty of Toussaint. I said Toussaint Louverture, 2023. 1. C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins, was first published in London in the summer of 1938 by Secker and Warburg. Later that year, it would appear from Dial in New York. James, 1901, had moved from colonial Trinidad to metropolitan Britain only 6 years before. In March 1932, initially a self-consciously literary man, oriented vaguely towards Bloomsbury, modernist realism, and with no more than the incipient sense of anti-colonial, let alone socialist politics. Within these 6 years, he had more or less abandoned his commitment to write fiction and established himself at the center of both the Marxist debates about the Soviet Union and the prospects of the new international left, the anti-colonial debate about national and black self-determination. These would form interlocking axis, shaping the analytical and political framework of the Black Jacobins. Specifically, the anti-colonial question in the British West Indies was centrally a question about the rise and fall and social and economic effects of plantation slavery. In 1933 to 1934, shortly after James arrived in Britain, where there were centennial celebrations on the passage of the Parliamentary Act abolishing slavery throughout the British Empire. The act received royal assent on 28 August 1833 and took effect on August 1st, 1834, and in particular of the role of William Wilberforce and his humanitarian allies in the overcoming the prevailing West Indian slaving interests. Therefore, the widely accepted story of slavery abolished in British historiography was motivated and imitated. Animated by the idea, one may as well say, the racist conceit. That abolished was largely the benevolent act of British. The abolition was largely a benevolent act of English clarity towards a benign people, good for little more than service and brute labor. It was a story, therefore, that concluded occluded or disavowed both the facts of the unjust enrichment of Britons and British society out of the plunder and violation of black people for more than 200 years, and the fact that the enslaved were not merely passively grateful objects of rule, abjectly accommodating themselves to their conditions, but actively involved in their own emancipation. The Black Jacobins, James addressed himself to both these strands of racial prejudice in British historiography. But between them, his principal focus is the letter, namely the role of the enslaved in liberating themselves from their bondage. And clear and most dramatic historical instance of the self-emancipation of the enslaved was the Saint Domingue insurrection that led to the Haitian Revolution. For James, in the Black Jacobin, the story of the Haitian Revolution told as a revolutionary account of a revolutionary history, learned in part from Jules Michelet's History of French Revolution and Leon Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, is the story of black anti-colonial self-determination embodied in the vindicating singularity of Toussaint Louverture.
Toussaint.
Above all, it is Toussaint that fascinates James, almost to the point, perhaps, of identification. Indeed, James was already thinking about Toussaint and what he represented as a historic black figure before he left Trinidad for Britain. And throughout the Black Jacobins, he struggles with how best to render his protagonist satisfactorily as a distinctive historical actor. The circumstances of his conditions as a relatively privileged enslaved man, James apparently did not know that Toussaint was already a free and slave-owning black person at the time of the insurrection. The noteworthy qualities of his personality, the ideas and forces that moved him, and so on. For James, Toussaint was exceptional, unprecedented novel. He is not only a Caribbean Creole, and therefore neither African nor European. He is entirely modern, a subjugated product of the shaping social and economic technologies, a proto-factory sugar plantation. But this is not all. Toussaint is not only modern in the sense of all the enslaved were obliged to be or become modern. He is the embodiment of an quintessentially modern subject, the intellectual. The intellectual is not merely someone who thinks creatively, someone whose very form of life is mediated and activated through the temporal fold of reflexive beings. In this respect, for James, Toussaint is wholly unlike most of his black contemporaries. Unlike McCandle, an earlier rebel leader, for example, unlike Jean Jacquin's Dessalines, Toussaint's general and successor. Both men are remarkable intelligence, courage, and will, but not intellectuals. A part of what intrigues James about this quality is that it was at once a gift and a curse. It is what enables Toussaint to see in a visionary way that others around him cannot see. And it is also what from a certain point in his career of leadership blinds him in what lies underneath his nose and clouds the clarity and decisiveness of his action. Across the arc of the Black Jacobins, James endlessly troubles over the form of life of an intellectual and political leader who is struggling to do what has never been done before. It is a central dimension of Toussaint's singularity, of his sheer novelty and his subjectivity and his undertaking that he did not know with certainty where he was going or how he would get there. This is crucial to James' point about Toussaint. He could not have known. He had no blueprint to guide him. And so he could not have foreseen what the horizon or endgame of the insurrection he was leading should be. He could not know, for example, as those after him would claim to know, that he would have been heading towards nation state sovereignty all along. We who read the Black Jacobins in our time with a ready-made anti-colonialism that Toussaint could not have had follow him, sometimes with frustration, as he stumbles around his given world without a map trying to find his way. He knows that his is a fight for freedom from slavery, when even with so, to us, elementary a project, he has to work out through experience and reflection. The idea is that the relevant freedom cannot be for himself and a few select officers alone, but must be for all the enslaved. Nor is it transparently clear that he should become governor of the colonial territory, let alone its sovereign. This idea of independence is a hard-earned notion of political order that Toussaint's educated and well-traveled contemporaries in the newly minted United States are only then beginning to work out. How and by what process he comes to the conclusion he arrives at are questions that intrigue James. Again, in trying to work out the mode of labor that should accompany liberation from slavery, Toussaint angers some of his most trusted comrades, his nephew, Mazie, among them. When he returns the enslaved to the plantation, and to add insult to injury, sometimes even to their former enslavers. But for James, this is not surely because Toussaint is cynically indifferent to the brutality of plantation labor, or ignorant of what it symbolizes to the enslaved, but rather because he can dimly inchoately recognize the Saint Domingo is intrigued into a wider system, and he thus believes that the sugar plantation is a necessary part of survival of his fledgling state. In the post-colonial world, this belief is now a familiar one. After all, from the vantage point of decolonization, it is easy to see that delinking from colonial capitalism might have been, at least, as catastrophic to the Toussaint as neo-colonial political leaders have imagined or feared in the contemporary Caribbean. Similarly, James was well aware that he would have to meet the question of Toussaint's supposed enchantment with Europe. Was Toussaint merely a subpen, a Europhile, a mimic man? Was Europe simply the hegemonic condition of his formation as a man, an intellectual, and a political leader? Or was it also, and more deeply, the motivating impetus of his moral aspiration? Given the information of the Caribbean, the destruction of the native population, and the fragmenting cultural processes involved in the enslavement of Africans. These were unavoidable questions, and they would have been a special renaissance for James as a Caribbean colonial intellectual, a political activist himself, grappling with the presence of Europe in his own orientations. attitudes, desires, and so on. A search for an idiom in which to express his own destructive individuality. Undoubtedly, for James, Toussaint was not merely superficially formed by European civilization as a normative structure of dominant language, ideas, values, technologies, and expectations?
Yes.
All right? All right.
Yes.
For some reason it didn't look like that. For some reason it looked like a different word. My bad. Who's in here? No. Okay. There we go. He was also a man of a radical enlightenment. This is the point of his seeming acquaintance with the Abbé Raynal's famous book, A Philosophical and Political History of the Settlements of and Trade of the Europeans and in the East and West Indies. I said in, sorry, I know it's
Caribbean.
What?
Instead of saying, you wouldn't say East and West Indies, you'd say Caribbean. The old English slave masters called it the Indies.
Okay. Therefore, James put it, revolutionary France constituted more than a framework of his mind. It was the fertile ground for the new mode of social existence based on the idea of natural liberty that was not justifiably open to him. And yet, notably, James is also careful to say that while Toussaint held European civilization in the highest esteem, he was not seduced by it. He conferred upon it no moral superiority. He remained undeceived by the criminality and duplicity of racism of European imperialism. 2. Throughout. I'm good for right now. I have hard times with pronunciations. That's all I have problems with. Throughout his life, we're just on the introduction for right now. We're just getting through the introduction. Throughout his life, James kept returning to the Black Jacobins in a revisionary attitude, as though it kept generating new questions for him, especially new questions about Toussaint Louverture. In the preface to the first edition, James had located the writing he had carried out in the context of certain world historical circumstances: Stalin purges, the Spanish Civil War, the emergence of the international left around Trotsky, and indicated that had it been written under other circumstances, it would have been a different, if not a better book. For James then, circumstances mattered. When in the early 1960s he returned to the text, the context was substantially different from the one in which he had originally written it's in 1930s. In particular, there was a new dawn of African and Caribbean independence, with its hopes and disappointments, and there was a Cuban revolution, offering an example of political sovereignty more radical than any prevailing in the Caribbean. The second and revised edition, the Black Jacobins, was published in New York by Vintage in 1963, and it brought the text to the attention of a whole new generation of readers ready for the story of revolutionary change in the Caribbean. In the new editions, James introduced 2 principal revisions that, in some respects, gave the book a slightly different feel than the original edition. The first of these revisions consists of the 6 dense paragraphs added to the beginning of the final chapter, the War of Independence, the great climax of the story of slave revolution. These paragraphs explicitly introduce the theme of the tragic and understanding the rise and fall of Toussaint Louverture's. James had been thinking systematically about tragedy as a principle of historical poetics since the 1950s, especially in the context of the work that informed mariners, renegades, I said Mariners.
No,
Second
it's
time.
Mariners.
Mariners, thank you. Renegades and Castaways, published in 1953. Why did Toussaint make the errors that, from a certain point in his leadership, drove him extraordinary, oh my gosh. It's the EX that gets me. You don't know it, huh?
Inexorably.
Inexorably, thank you. I know what it means. Towards disaster. Characteristically refusing the psychological description of Toussaint as a divided personality, the ideal of the tragic gave James a way of situating Toussaint's dilemma in terms of an actor at the historical crossroads caught in the paradoxical moment of incommensurable alternatives between which it was nevertheless necessary to decide either a return to slavery, as he knew Napoleon was planning on the one hand, or Saint Domingo. Is it Domingo?
Saint Domingue.
Domingue without France on the other. Given who he was, a former slave and a man of an enlightenment, neither was possible for him to imagine. And so, from being a leader, a decisive action, Toussaint became the paralyzed embodiment of the vacillation that was eventually to ruin him, insisting as always on Toussaint's human complexity, the integrity. James urged us to see in him a man with embellished intentions, derailed neither by unblemished intentions, derailed neither by cowardice nor complicity, but by circumstances that were at once constructive of his predicament and beyond his personal control. The second major revision in the 1963 edition consists of the inclusion of the now famous appendix from Toussaint Louverture to Fidel Castro. What connects Toussaint Louverture and Fidel Castro? James memorably argued it is not the obvious fact that they were leaders of successful revolutions. Rather, what links them is that they are exemplars of a Caribbean sensibility, and the processes that they set in motion were derived from a distinctly Caribbean historical predicament, perhaps even a distinctive Caribbean civilization. The history of the Caribbean, James said, was governed by two principal factors: the sugar plantation and black slavery. And these together had imposed a process of social structures and a pattern of social identity across the Caribbean that differentiated it from Europe and Africa, as well as continental America. In one of the most insightful passages in the appendix, James says that the sugar plantation is simultaneously a demoralizing and civilizing institution. It introduced powers that both destroyed old moral and cultural forms of life and conscripted the enslaved into a new and entirely modern social existence. I need to turn off this thing. Hold on a second, everybody. I'm putting on a fan, it's too cold. By this, James means to point out the modern proto-factory character of the plantation as a labor regime and to its insertion into the modernizing capitalist world system. Consequently, from the outset, as James puts it, the enslaved lived an essentially and inescapable modern life. Less than the decade later, in 1971, James returned once more to the text of Black Jacobins in another revisionary attitude, and once again with implications for our understanding of Toussaint Louverture. The occasion was a series of lectures at the Institute of Black World, Atlanta, a remarkable institution that between 1969 and 1983 served as a forum for radical black discussions. not least between Caribbean and American intellectuals. James gave 3 lectures, quote, How I Wrote the Black Jacobins, and then quote, The Black Jacobins and Black Revolutionaries and Comparative Analysis, and quote, How I Rewrite the Black Jacobins. Each of the lectures is a tour de force of originality, erudition, and lucidity. Not least James, deeply appreciative reflection on W.E.B. Du Bois in 1935 account of post-slavery America. Perhaps, though, of most significance, here is the third of the lectures, James Reflections on what he might do differently, where he too be writing the book then. In the early 1970s, again, the context matters. This was the era of Black power in the United States, and there was a deeper sense, certainly keener than was the case in the 1930s or even in the earlier 1960s. That Black history should be written not from the perspective of elites, but from the point of view of the folk, of the ordinary and largely unremembered men and women who make history from below. James, who had been teaching at Federal City College in Washington, D.C., as a visiting professor, was clearly attuned to this critique of the historiographical mode of heroic agency. In his lecture, he tells his audience that where he writing of Black Jacobins, then he would not write it from the perspective of Toussaint and the other well-known leaders, but from that of the nameless slave rebels who actually made the revolution what it was. Writing, because as Marxists, we believe that there is no great man, that no man can do anything without the masses. The masses are the ones that help the person to achieve the goals. So like he's talking about, like, he wants to write from the perspective of the masses. Was an endless recursive process of revision and recontextualization, of asking again and again what the present circumstances enabled him to see or urge him to emphasize of the past he was recounting. The Black Jacobin is undoubtedly a classic of historical literature, but what makes it so? And why should we think of it as a classic, not only of Caribbean history specifically, or Black history, but rather of world history? A classic evidently is a book one feels compelled to return to again and again. Yep. A book read by generations after generations, not because it offers us invaluable information or refutable facts, but because it tells a story that reflects back to us recognizable dimensions of human spirit struggling against vicious odds, to affirm, enhance, and expand the given boundaries of our common humanity. This is what Black Jacobins offers us in a luminous, unforgettable narrative whose attenuative rhythm and dramatic contours points towards the sustaining extrogens. Is that right? Extrogens of the common human value. Pivotal to this scene, the Black Jacobins, as a irrepressible classic, I believe is precisely its invocation of a radical novelty and radical universality of Toussaint Louverture, as James says of him in the closing poignant sentence of the 1963 appendix. Toussaint was, quote, the first and greatest of the West Caribbeans. By this he means that Toussaint was literally unprecedented, unparalleled, or not simply in the sense that he had no equal, but in the strict sense that he was original, singular, and hitherto inconceivable form of human life. As everyone who reads this book will immediately recognize, James Toussaint was not simply an ordinary figure of remote and provincial. I don't know how to say that word. I'm gonna go look it up. It's an easy word, I just can't say it.
Do you mean provincial?
Yeah, that was the one. Provincial. Local knowledge. He was the larger-than-life figure of a historical world a larger-than-life figure of a heroic world historical universality. He was a man who, while completely shaped by the constraining particularities of his degraded, enslaved circumstances, he was nevertheless not reducible to them. His life and his project have a meaning, in other words, that transcends the specific framework of his time and place, or rather, in Toussaint, that specificity of time and place are lived in the dimension of universality. His vision not given to him all at once, but emerging stage by stage through the gradual given to him all at once by emerging through the gradual assimilation and transformation of the experience of the white supremacist normativity of a slave empire, forged an integral idea of human freedom, namely a freedom born of slave emancipation, in striving to define and redefine the terms of this emancipation. It is true, Toussaint falters, and in the end, he fails perhaps, but the gift of his example has already been perceived, even by his mortal enemies, and that seeming failure is itself paradoxically the exemplary mark of his tragic humanity. This is what James is unwaveringly admires in his hero, even when he disappoints him. The audacity with which, to a very end, he claims his moral and political right to the self-determination violently deny him and his fellow liberators of his willingness to sacrifice what Abraham Lincoln famously called the, quote, last full measures of devotion in the vindication of that claim, and for giving us this vivid picture of one of the exemplification of virtue and excellence, we remain indebted to C.L.R. James. David Scott, February 2023. David Scott teaches the part. I don't care about that. Okay, should we read the prelogue? Let me see. It looks like it. Looks like it's important. What do you think? I think it's important. It's not that long. Not that long. We'll read it. Yeah, let's read it. Prelogue. Christopher Columbus landed first in the New World at the island of San Salvador, and after praising God, inquired urgently for gold. The natives, indigenous, they used the color of indigenous skin, were peaceable and friendly, and directed him to Haiti, a large island as large as Ireland, rich, they said, in the yellow metal. He sailed to Haiti, one of his ships being wrecked. The Haitians indigenous helped him so willingly that very little was lost, and of the articles which they brought on shore, not one was stolen. The Spaniards, the most advanced Europeans of their day, annexed the island, called it Hispaniola, and took the backward natives under their protection. They introduced Christianity, forced labor in mines, murdered grape, bloodhounds, strange diseases, and artificial famine, by the destruction and cultivation to starve the rebellious. These and other requirements of the higher civilization reduced the native population from the estimate of 500,000, perhaps 1,000,000, to 60,000 in 15 years. La Casa, I think that's it, La Casa, a Dominican priest with the conscience, traveled to Spain to plead for the abolition of native slavery. But without coercion of the natives, how would the colony exist? All the natives received as wages was Christianity, and they could be good Christians without working in the mines. The Spanish government comprised. It abolished the, I don't know how to say that word.
Repartamentos. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Or forced labor in law, while its agents in the colonial in the colony maintained it in fact. Las Casas, C-A-S-A-S, haunted at the prospect of seeing before his eyes the total destruction of a population within one generation, hit on the expedient of importing the more robust black people from the populous Africa. In 1517, Charles V authorized the export of 15,000 slaves to San Domingo, and thus priest and king launched on the world the American slave trade and slavery. The Spanish settlement founded by Columbus was on the southeast of the island. In 1629, some wandering Frenchmen sought a home in a little island of Tortuga, 6 miles off the north coast of Santo Domingo, to be followed by Englishmen and Dutchmen from Santa Cruz. What were you going to say?
It's called Tortuga.
Tortuga was healthy, and in the forests of western Santo Domingo roamed millions of wild cattle, which could be hunted for food and hides. To Tardigo came fugitives from justice escaped, galley slaves, debtors unable to pay their bills, adventurers seeking adventure, or quick fortunes, men of all crimes and all nationalities, French, British, and Spaniards, slaughtered one another for nearly 30 years, and the British were actually in possession of I can't say it. Tortuga. At one time. But by 1659, the French buccaneers prevailed. They sought the suzerainty of France and demanded a chief of some woman from Tartugo. They laid a firm basis on Santo Domingo and moved there to drive away this president intruders. The Spaniards organized a great hunt and unalived all the bulls they could find in order to ruin the cattle business. The French retaliated by the civilization of cocoa, then indigo and cotton. Yes, thank you. Already they knew the sugarcane. Lacking capital, they raided the English island of Jamaica and stole money and 2,000 black people. French, British, and Spaniards raided and counter-raided and burnt to the ground. But in 1695, the Treaty of Ryswick between France and Spain gave the French a legal right to the western part of the island. In 1734, the colonists began to cultivate coffee. The land was fertile. France offered a good market, but they wanted labor. In addition to black people, they brought whites and engages. Who, I don't know what that is. What's that mean? The engages. What do you think that means?
That's like indentured servant.
All right. Okay. Who would be freed after a period of years? Yes. So little did they bring the black people because they're going to use it barbarous or black. They used it. Okay. The earlier laws prescribed similar regulations for both black slaves and white indentures. I'm going to say that. But under the regimen of those days, the whites could not stand the climate. So the slavers brought more and more black people in numbers that leapt by thousands every year until the drain of Africa ran into the millions. Number 1, chapter 1, property. All right, anybody have any questions before we move on? I know we just did the introduction, we did some stuff. Anything? We good? We good? I guess we're good. Analyzing expert of James and Black Jacobins okay. All right, the property. The slavers scored the coast of Guinea. As they devastated an area, they moved westward and then south, decade after decade, past the Niger, down to the Congo coast, last Luengo and Angola, round the Cape of Good Hope, and by 1789, even as far as Mozambique on the eastern side of Africa. Guinea remained their chief hunting grounds. From the coast, they organized expeditions far into the interior. They set the simple tradesmen fighting against each other with modern weapons over thousands of square miles. The propagandists of the time claimed that, however cruel was the slave traffic, the African slave in America was happier than in his own African civilization. Ours, too, is an age of propaganda. We excel at our... So they're basically saying that their propaganda said they wanted to do this because, yeah. We excel our ancestors only in systems and organizations. They led as fluently and as brazenly.
Wow.
Brazenly and fluently. What'd you say?
You said they led. It's they lied.
Okay, they lied as fluently and as brazenly. In the 16th century, Central Africa was a territory of peace and happy civilization. Traders traveled thousands of miles from one side of the continent to the other without molestation. The tribal wars from which the European pirates claimed to deliver the people were mere sham fighters. It was a great battle when half a dozen men were unalived. It was on a peasantry in many respects superior to the serfs in large areas of Europe that the slave trade fell. Tribal life was broken up, and millions of detribalized Africans were let loose upon each other. The unceasing destruction of crops led to cannibalism. The captive women became concubines and degraded the status of the wife. Tribes had to supply slaves or be sold as slaves themselves. Violence and ferocity became the necessity for survival, and violence and ferocity survived. The stockades of grinning skulls, the human sacrifices, the selling of their own children as slaves, these horrors were the product of an intolerable pressure on the African peoples, which became fiercer through the centuries as the demand for industry increased and the methods of coercion were perfected. The slaves were collected in the interior, fastened one to the other in columns, loaded it with heavy stones of 40 to 50 pounds in weight to prevent attempts at escape, and then marched a long journey to the sea, sometimes hundreds of miles, and the weakly and sick dropped and died in the African jungle. Some were brought to the coast by canoe, lying in the bottom of the boats for days on end, their hands bound, their faces exposed to the tropical sun, the tropical rain, their backs in the water, which was never bailed out. At the slave ports, they were pinned into trunks for the inspections of the buyers. Night and day, thousands of human beings were packed in these dens of putrefaction, so that no European could stay in them for longer than a quarter of an hour without fainting. The Africans fainted and recovered, or fainted and died, the mortality in the trunks being over 20% inside the harbor, waiting to empty the trunks as they filled was the captain of the slave ship, with so clear a conscience that one of them, in the intervals of waiting to enrich British capitalism with the profits of another valuable cargo, enrich British religion by composing the hymn, "How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds." On the ship, the slaves were packed in the holds of galleries, one above the other. Each was given only 4 or 5 feet in length and 2 or 3 feet in height. Man, that was crammed. So that they could neither lie at full length nor sit upright, contrary to the lies that have been spread so precariously about black people's docility, the revolts at the port, the embarkations, and on board were incessant, so that the slaves had to be chained, right hand to right leg, left hand to right leg, and attached in rows to long iron bars. In this position they lived for the voyage, coming up once a day for exercise and to allow the sailors to clean the pails. But when the cargo was rebellious or the weather bad, then they stayed below for weeks at a time. The close proximity of many naked human beings, their bruises and festering flesh, the fotid air and prevailing dysentery, the accumulation of filth turned these holds into hell. During the storms, the hatches were battened down, and in the close of the lonesome darkness, they were hurled from one side to another by the heavy vessel, held in position by the chains of their bleeding flesh. No place on earth, observed one writer of the time, concentrated so much misery as the hold of the slave ship. Oh, someone got blocked. Twice a day, at 9 and at 4, they received their food. To the slave traders, they were articles of trade and no more. The captain held up by calms or adverse winds. Calms or adverse winds was known to have prisoned his cargo. Another killed some of his slaves to feed the others with the flesh. Ugh. They died not only from the regime, but from grief and rage and despair. They overtook vast hunger strikes, undid their chains, and hurled themselves on the crew in futile attempts at insurrection. So they even had insurrections on the fucking boat. What could these inland tradesmen do on the open sea, in the complicated sailing vessel? To brighten their spirits, it became the custom to have them on the deck once a day and force them to dance. Some took the opportunity to jump overboard, uttering cries of triumph as they cleared the vessel and disappeared below the surface. Interesting. Fear of their cargo bred a S-word cruelty in the crew. So that's going to the crew. So savage cruelty in the crew. So that S-word is going towards the crew, not the enslaved people. One captain, to strike terror into the rest, killed a slave and divided heart, liver, and entrails into 300 pieces, made each of the slaves eat one. Oh my God. Threatened those who refused with the same torture. Such incidents were not rare. Given the circumstances, such things were and are inevitable. Nor did the system spare the slavers. Every year, 1/5 of all who took part in the African trade died. All America and the West Caribbean took slaves. When the ships reached the harbor, the cargo came up on the deck to be bought. The purchasers examined them for defects, looked at the teeth, pinched the skin, sometimes tasted the perspiration, to see if the slave's blood was pure and his health was good as his appearance. Ugh. Some of the women affected a curiosity, an indulgence of which, with a horse, would have caused them to be kicked 20 yards across the deck. But the slaves had to stand it. Then, in order to restore the dignity which might have been lost by too intimate, an examination, the purchaser spat in the face of the slave. Having become the property of his owner, he was branded on both sides of the breast with a hot iron. His duties were explained to him by the interpreter. The priest instructed him in the first principle of Christianity. Jesus, there you go. That's the beginning of the. Wow. Okay. All right. Hold on a second. Anybody have any questions before I go on? It's pretty detailed. I didn't realize this. That like it makes sense. I mean, I should have thought about that. These slave revolts actually happened over the seas and shit. So that's pretty cool. This sucks, honestly. Something new. The stranger of San Domingo was awakened by the crack of the whip, the stifled cries, the heavy groans of black people who saw the sun rise, only to curse it from its renewal of their labors and their pains. Their work began at daybreak. At 8, they stopped for a short breakfast and worked again until midday. They began again at 2 o'clock and worked until evening, sometimes even 10 or 11. A Swiss traveler, has left a famous description of a gang of slaves at work. Quote, they were about 100 men and women of different ages, all occupied in digging ditches in the cane fields, the majority of them naked or covered with rags. The sun shone down with full force on their heads. Sweat rolled from all parts of their bodies, their limbs weighed down by the heat, fatigue with the weight of their picks, and by the resistance of their clayey soil baked hard enough to break their implements, strained themselves to overcome every obstacle. The mournful silence reigned. Exhaustion was stamped on every face, but the hour of rest had not yet come. The pitiless eyes and the managers patrolled the gang, and several foremen armed with long whips moved periodically between them, giving stinging blows to all whom, worn out by fatigue, were compelled to take a rest, men and women, young or old. End quote. This was no isolated picture. The sugar plantations demanded an exacting and ceaselessly labor. The tropical earth is baked hard by the sun round every carry of land intended for cane. It was necessary to dig a large ditch to ensure circulation of air. Young canes require attention for the first 3 or 4 months and grew in maturity in 14 to 18 months. Cane would be planted and would grow at any time of the year, and the reaping of one crop was the single for the immediate digging of ditches and the planting of another. Once cut, they had to be rushed to the mill, lest the juice became acid by fermentation. The extraction of the juice and manufacture of the raw sugar went on for three weeks a month. Raw sugar went on for 3 weeks a month, 16 to 18 hours a day, for 7 or 8 months in a year. Worked like animals, the slaves were housed like animals in huts built around a square planted with provisions and fruits. These huts were about 20 to 25 feet long, 12 feet wide, and about 15 feet height, divided by partitions into 2 or 3 rooms. They were windowless, and light entered only by the door. The floor was beaten beaten earth, and bled was the straw, hides, or a rude contrivance. What's that word?
Contrivance.
What's that?
Like a put together lazily thing.
Yeah, rude contrivance of cord tied on a post. On this slept indiscriminately mother, father, and children, defenseless against their masters. They struggle with overwork and its usual complement, underfeeding. The Black Person Code, Louis, oh my gosh, this is 1014, Louis the 14th, right?
Yes.
Attempt to ensure them humane treatment, ordered that they should be given every week 2 pots and a half of, I don't know that word, Moniac. 3 cassavas. I'm gonna look at these things.
Go ahead.
Kvass, okay. 2 pounds of salt beef and 3 pounds of salted fish. About food enough to last a healthy man for 3 days. Instead, their masters gave them a half a dozen pints of coarse flour, rice, and peas, and a half dozen herring. Worn out by their labors all through the day and far into the night, many neglected to cook and ate the raw food. The rations was so small and given to them so irregularly that often the last half of the week found them without nothing. Even the 2 hours they were given in the middle of the day and the holiday on Sunday and feast days were not for rest, but in order that they might cultivate a small piece of land to supplement their regular rations. Hard-working slaves cultivated vegetables, raised chickens, to sell in the towns to make a little in order to buy rum and tobacco, and there and here and there a Napoleon of finance, by luck and industry, could make enough to purchase his freedom. Their masters encouraged them in this practice of cultivation, for in years of scarcity, the Black people died in the thousands. Epidemics broke out. The slaves fled into the woods, and plantations were ruined. Where we at? Okay. The difficulty was that though one could trap them like animals, transport them in pens, work them alongside as ass or a horse, and beat both with the same stick, stable them and starve them, they remained, despite their black skins and curly hair, quite invincibly human beings. With the intelligence and I can't say this word, resentments of human beings, right?
Yes.
Resentments. Okay. To cow them into the necessary docility and acceptance necessitate a regime of calculated brutality and terrorism. And it is this that explains the unusual spectacle of property owners apparently carelessly and preserving their property. They had first to ensure their own safety. For the least fault, the slaves received the harshest punishment. In 1685, the Black Code authorized whippings, and in 1702, one colonist, a Marquez, thought any punishment which demanded more than 100 blows of the whip was serious enough to be handed over to the authorities. Later, the number was fixed at 39, then raised to 50. But the colonists paid no attention to these regulations, and slaves were not unfrequently whipped to death. The whip was not always an ordinary cane or woven cord, as the code demanded. Sometimes it was replaced by the riguas, or thick thong of cowhide, or by a lianes, lanes, local growths of reeds, simple and plaint, like whalebone.
Supple and pliant.
Like whalebone. The slaves received a whip with more certainty and regularity. Jesus Christ. Then they received their food. It was the incentive to work and the guardian of discipline. But there was no ingenuity that fear or a deprived imagination could devise, which was not employed to break their spirits and satisfy lust and resentment of their owners and guardians. Irons on the hands and feet, blocks of wood that the slaves had to drag behind them wherever they went. The tin plate mask designed to prevent the slaves eating the sugar cane. The iron collar. Whipping was interrupted in order to pass a piece of hot wood on the buttocks of the victim. Salt, pepper, citron, cedar, aloes, and hot ashes were poured on the bleeding wound. Mutilations? Okay, Jesus, I'm not having a good day today. Mutilations were common. Limbs, ears, and sometimes private parts to deprive them of their pleasure, which they could indulge in without expense. Their masters poured burning wax on their arms and hands and shoulders, emptied the boiling cane sugar over their heads, burning them alive, roasting them on slow fires, filling them with gunpowder and blowing them up with a match, burned them up to the neck and smeared their heads with the sugar, and that the flies might devour them, fastened them near the nest of ants and wasps, made them eat their excrement, drink their urine, and lick the saliva of other slaves. One colonist was known in moments of anger to throw himself on his slaves and stick his teeth into their flesh. Wild, weird. Were these tortures so well authenticated, habitual, and were they merely isolated incidents? The extravagant, I can't say the damn word.
Extravagances.
Yeah, I said the extravagances of a few half-crazed, colonialists. Impossible as it is to substantiate hundreds of cases, yet all the evidence shows that these bestial practices were normal features of slave life. The torture of the whip, for instance, had 1,000 refinements, but there were regular varieties that had special names. So common were they. When the hands and arms were tied to 4 posts on the ground, the slaves was said to undergo, quote, the 4 posts. If the slave was tied to a ladder, it was, quote, the torture of the ladder. If he was suspended by 4 limbs, it was the hammock, etc. The pregnant woman was not spared her 4 posts. A hole was digged in the earth to accommodate the unborn child. The torture of the collar was especially reserved for women who were suspected of abortion, and the collar never left their neck until they had produced a child. The blowing up of a slave had its own name, quote, to burn a little powder in the arse of the inwards, end quote. Obviously, this was no freak, but a recognized practice. After an exhaustive examination, the best that Vassir can say is that there were good masters and there were bad, and his impression, quote, but only an impression, is that the former were more numerous than the latter. There are and always will be some who ashamed of the behavior of their ancestors, try to prove that slavery was not so bad after all, that its evils and its cruelty were the exaggeration of propagandists and not the habitual lot of the slaves. Men will say and accept anything in order to foster national pride or soothe the troubled conscience. Undoubtedly, there were kind masters who did not indulge in these refinements of cruelty, and those slaves merely suffered overwork, undernourishment, and the whip. But the slaves in Santo Domingo could not replenish their number by reproduction. After that dreaded journey across the ocean, a woman was usually sterile for 2 years, and the life of Santo Domingo killed them off fast. The planters deliberately worked them to death rather than waiting for children to grow up. But the professional whitewashers are insisted by the writings of a few contemporary observers who describe sense of idyllic beauty. Of these is von Blanc, whom we shall meet again, and those testimonies we will understand better when we know more of him. In his memoirs, he shows us a plantation on which there were no prisons, no dungeons, no punishments to speak of. If the slaves were naked, the climate was such as not to render this an evil, and those who complained forgot a perfectly disgusting rags that were so often seen in France. The slaves were exempt from unhealthy, fatiguing, dangerous work, such was performed by the workers of Europe. They did not have They did
not have to descend
into the bowels of the earth, nor dig deep pits. They did not construct subterranean galleries. They did not work in the factories where French workers breathed a deadly and infected air. They did not elevate roofs. They did not carry enormous burdens. The slaves, he concluded, had light work to do and were happy to do it. Von Blanc, in Santo Domingo, so sympathetic to the sorrows of labor in France, had to fly from Paris in August 1792 to escape the wrath of the French workers. Malout, Malouet, was an official in the colonies and fellow reactionary of the Von Blanc against all change in the colonies, also sought to give some ideas of the privilege of slavery. Jesus. The first he notes is that the slaves, on attaining his majority, began to enjoy, quote, the pleasures of love, and his master has no interest in preventing the indulgence of his taste. To such impertinent folly can the defense of property drive even the intelligent man, supposed in his time to be sympathetic towards black people. The majority of the slaves accommodated themselves to this unceasing brutality by profound fatalism and a wooden unintelligent before their masters. Quote, why do you ill-treat your mule in that way? Asked a colonist of a carter. I don't know what that means. Quote, but when I do not work, I am beaten. When he does not work, I beat him. He is my black person. They use the N-word. One old black person, having lost one of his ears and condemned to lose another, begged the governor to spare it, for if that too was cut off, he would have nowhere to put his stump of a cigarette. A slave sent by his masters into his neighbor's garden to steal is caught and brought back to the man who had only a few minutes before dispatched him on an errand. the master orders him a punishment of 100 lashes, to which the slave submits without a murmur. When caught in error, they persisted in denial with the same fatalistic unintelligence. A slave is accused of stealing a pigeon. He denies it. The pigeon is discovered hidden in his shirt. Well, look at that pigeon. It take my shirt for a nest. That's weird. Through the shirt of another, a master can feel the potatoes, which he denies he has stolen. They are not potatoes, he says. They are stones. He is undressed, and the potatoes fall to the ground. Master, the devil is wicked. Put stones and look, you find potatoes. On holidays, when not working on their private plots or dancing, they sat for hours in front of their huts, giving no sign of life. Wives and husbands, children and parents were separated at the will of the master, and the father and son would meet after many hours and give no greeting or any sign of emotion. Many slaves could never be got to stir at all unless they were whipped. Suicide was a common habit, and such was their disregard for life that they often killed themselves, not for personal reasons, but in order to spite their owner. Life was hard, and death, they believed, meant not only releasing, but to return to Africa. Those who wished to believe and to convince the world that the slaves were half-human brutes, fit for nothing else but slavery, could find ample evidence of their faith, and in nothing so much as in their homicidal mania of the slaves. Prison was their method. The poison was their method. A mistress would poison a rival to retain the valuable affections of her inconsistent owner. A discarded mistress would poison master, wife, children, and slaves. A slave robbed of his wife by one of his masters would poison him, and this was one of the most frequent causes of poisoning. If the planter conceived a passion for a young slave, her mother would poison his wife, and with the idea of placing her daughter at the head of the household. The slaves would poison the younger children of the master in order to ensure the plantation succeeded to one son. By this means, they prevented the plantation being broken up and the gang dispersed. On certain plantations, the slaves decimated their numbers by poison, so as to keep the number of slaves small and prevent their masters embarking on large schemes which would increase the work. For this reason, a slave would poison his wife, another would poison his children, and a black nurse declared in court that for years she had poisoned every child that she brought into the world. Nurses employed in hospitals poisoned sick soldiers to rid themselves of unpleasant work. The slaves would even poison the property of the masters whom they loved. He was going away. A poisoned cows, horse, mules, and plantations was thrown into disorder, and the beloved master was compelled to remain. The most dreadful of all this cold-blooded murder was, however, the jaw sickness, a disease which attacked children only in the first few days of their existence. Their jaws were closed to such an extent that it was impossible to open them and to get anything down, with the result that they died of hunger. It was not a natural disease and never attacked children delivered by white women. The black midwives alone could cause it, and it is believed that they performed some simple operations on the newborn child, which resulted in the jaw sickness. Whatever the method This disease caused the death of nearly 1/3 of the children born on plantations. We're going to end here. We're going to stop right here on page 34. And it says, what was the intellectuals level of the slaves? So yeah, like they're like, I don't want my child to have to endure all this stuff. And I don't think you need more things, you know? Okay, it won't let me highlight. It won't let me highlight.
Oh, that's weird. It let me highlight.
And it won't let me save a thing.
Okay, well, I'll make sure we get to it again.
Okay. I'm going to write it down anyways.
Okay. So, I don't know if this is so much a book that we discuss about like the other communist books, because this one's more of a just history book.
We'll find out. We can still talk about it. About how we feel about it and what we got from it and what we're learning from it. There's no reason not to do that. What do you think?
There's a bunch.
I mean, it was good. I learned that I knew that's the problem. Like I've read, I listened to like half this book before, but it was interesting for people that might not know how bad it really was, because it was horrible. It was absolutely torture.
Yeah. I think we actually were. Like this is the first book that actually comes into the contact of what happened what happened during the shipping of black people into enslavement. Like that was a good eye opener. And then when they got off and all those things and what they're trying to do to save their children by not allowing them to exist in the world of enslavement and stuff like that, like that seems to be a condition drawn in, because like why would you want your child to be born into a life like that? You know what I mean? Yeah. And it sounds like they were trying to force them into giving birth so they can have more enslaved people.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah. So yeah, tomorrow we're gonna say tomorrow we'll say what was the intellectual level of these slaves. So we're gonna go to what their intellectual level is. All right. Now, CLR James seems a little harsh on some things, but that's okay. He's being very detailed and to the point, and he's actually not trying to sugarcoat any of this, it seems like. So that's good. You know? And I liked how they talk about how, like, they try to make the slave masters in that situation, like, whitewashing it to be like, it wasn't all that bad. That's like the usual statements. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, white people. It wasn't that bad.
Slavery.
Yeah, or other countries did it too. You know what I mean?
Right.
Fuck. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll go ahead. If you have nothing else you'd like to say, no one wants to come up. Let's see. Do we have someone in here still? Yeah, they're still in here. Let's see. Oh, they're gone. Never mind. I thought they would come up, but they didn't.
Can we bring Aziz up for a second? Because I got a gift for Aziz.
Okay, Aziz in there. And see if Aziz takes the invitation.